They watched the horizon go dark. At first it was a thin gray line, then a moving wall of metal that swallowed the morning light and turned the sea into a pattern of decks and flags. Faces in the command room drained of color. An admiral pressed his palm to his mouth as if to hold in a sound. Someone muttered the name of a prediction and went suddenly very still. April 1, 1945. Okinawa. What arrived at that coastline that day was not only an invasion force, but a question that would haunt the high command. How had they underestimated the scale of assembly, and how quickly could that calculation be reversed? The sentence that would spread through the rooms and among the reports was brief, but its consequences would be unpacked for years. For now, the maps lay open, telegraphs clicked, and the men in the room read the same line and felt the same small panic. In the main briefing chamber, the air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and boiled tea. The paper of the maps felt damp at the edges, and the clatter of a distant radio kept time with the heartbeats of those present. Admiral Sato looked at General Mori and said nothing for a second. Then, quietly, he opened the meeting, and the first exchange began. "How many landing craft?" Sato asked. "Over 1,000 reported off Kurama now," Captain Hayashi answered, voice tight. "They came in under cloud cover," Colonel Tanaka said, fingers brushing the map as if searching for purchase. "Our destroyers cannot hold them all," Major Fujimoto said. "If they secure a beachhead, supplies will flow too fast for us to choke." "Then what do we do?" Mori asked. "We delay," Hayashi said. "We strike at the transports where we can." "We have no fuel for sustained attack," Tanaka replied. There were 5 exchanges in that scene, each short, each clipped, and each ending on the low thud of dread. The room heard the sea as a new drumbeat, the radio as static like distant thunder, the officers' breaths sharp and close. Reports arrived in envelopes stained with seawater and the smell of salt, and a junior analyst named Watanabe pushed forward an earlier document, an intelligence note that only months before had seemed alarmist. He had been dismissed then as overly pessimistic. Now the margins had been circled in red. The note, dated October 12, 1944, had predicted an American push precisely because of production trends. "Their docks will outpace their losses," Watanabe had written. "They will mount amphibious fleets with numbers we cannot match, without a decisive industrial shift." That line was read aloud and echoed in the chamber like an accusation and like a truth finally recognized. The backstory unfolded in fragments. How supply convoys had crossed from the west coast of America. How yards in the Midwest had switched to landing craft. How steel and rivets had been poured into hulls at a rate no single could have handled. The analyst who first wrote the note, Professor Nakamura, had been a civilian advisor. He had argued for dispersal strategies and for focusing on anti-transport tactics, but his voice had been sidelined. Now his pages were proof, folded and dog-eared, and the men who had ignored him traced his handwriting with weary fingers. The memory of that dismissal tasted like ash. A sense of inevitability gathered around the numbers on the paper. The technical reports that followed turned fear into arithmetic. Naval intelligence presented figures. Estimated American landing vessels in the area 1,235, with 840 support craft and 500 carrier sorties assigned in the first 24 hours. Army logistics reports listed tonnage, showing a capacity to shuttle supplies of over 30,000 tons within the first week if the beachhead held. Japanese production could not match those inflows. Steel output had dropped by 30% since 1944. Fuel reserves were measured in weeks, and aircraft replacements could be counted on only in the low hundreds per month. The language in the room was clinical and cold, officers reading aloud numbers that tasted like verdicts. A naval engineer named Fuji pointed at a chart and said, "Even if we sink 100 transports, we only delay the tide for days." The noise in the command room narrowed to the scratch of pens marking losses on maps, the rustle of paper like a wind across a battlefield, the occasional cough from a man trying to clear his throat without showing fear. The contrast between factory floors humming in distant cities and the quiet panic under the command chamber roof became a kind of cruelty. Then the leader asked the question that exposed the central dilemma. Admiral Sato turned, and in a voice that was deliberately small, he asked, "Can we stop them at the beaches?" The question was simple, but it carried everything: honor, strategy, survival. Silence swallowed the follow-up. "If we commit everything to a counter-assault," Captain Hayashi said, "we may win ground, but lose the fleet." "If we refuse to fight in strength," Colonel Tanaka answered, "we let cities fall and invite a deeper strike." "What about civilian evacuation?" Mori asked, as if speaking of numbers on a page. "There are no safe harbors left," Major Fujimoto replied. That exchange ran short and tight, 5 lines like a cord pulled taut. The room smelled now of metal polish and bad coffee. A young aide, Naito, ran his fingers over a crumpled casualty estimate and felt the paper cut his thumb. Outside, gulls circled above the water, and the distant thud of naval guns punctuated the morning like punctuation. A decrypt carried the pivot. At noon, a radio intercept that had been sitting under a stack of communications was marked urgent. The decoding officer, Commander Ishii, read the line in a voice that shook. "Americans ashore at dawn." 3 words, then 2, simple and irreversible. Moved through the room like a released trap. Men exhaled all at once, the sound of a held thing finally given up. The reaction was slow at first, like water warming under a lid. Sato stared at the sheet, then at the map. He folded the paper with care, as if it were fragile, as if treating it roughly might make the message less true. The tactical implications were immediate. Once forces were ashore, the window for introduction narrowed to hours, and frontline reinforcement became a strategic nightmare. The sensory details that followed were stark. The radio hummed with static that tasted metallic in the mouth. The scent of wet wool and machine oil filled the air. The floor underfoot creaked with the weight of boots, and the soft scuff of pages turning became the counting of time. A secret meeting convened under the stairwell of the command building that evening. Participants were named and present: Admiral Sato, General Mori, Captain Hayashi, Colonel Tanaka, Lieutenant Kuroda, Commander Ishii, Major Fujimoto, Counselor Yamazaki, and Aide Naito. The mood was conspiratorial and hard, with the weight of forbidden options. They spoke of desperate measures, of kamikaze tactics, of concentrating torpedoes in narrow channels, of burning the docks and denying ports, of a withdrawal that would save civilians but concede honor. "We can sink the transports at night," Ishii proposed. "We can send our pilots to die on decks," Kuroda said, voice dry. "If we do that, what remains to hold an island?" Yamazaki asked. "We could evacuate non-combatants to the hills," Naito offered. "There is no fuel to move them far," Tanaka countered. "Then we choose who lives," Mori said, the sentence halting like a blade. The discussion included 4 to 6 exchanges and ended with no clear answer. It was a series of rapid, direct lines as required, each one carrying the texture of a man feeling his way through a fog of duty and dread. The air in that room was cool, but tasted faintly of citrus from a tin of preserved fruit someone had nervously opened. The lamplight left sharp shadows on faces and made the sweat on brows shine like oil. The next days were an escalation of cost and calculation. Bombardments carved the shoreline, towns burned, and on April 7, even a bold counterstroke cost 3 cruisers and hundreds of trained sailors. Within 2 weeks, the defenders had seen losses measured in tens of thousands of men and civilians, displaced from coastal towns. Supply lines frayed, and the hope of relief from mainline reinforcements dwindled as airfields were taken.
The figures were brutal and precise. 3,000 Japanese troops killed in the first week on the island, 15 merchant vessels lost to carrier aircraft, and over 50,000 civilians made homeless as bombardment flattened neighborhoods. The command watched as maps turned from green to brown to black, each color change a ledger of human cost. They read reports from frontline commanders like appeals.
From the edge of a cliff, hands tremulous as they signed them. The crisis was now both moral and strategic. In the end, the decision carried the shape of a compromise that tried to save what could be saved. Admiral Sato convened the council and chose a course that would concentrate remaining forces in interior strongholds rather than waste men in futile coastal counterattacks. He ordered an organized withdrawal from the most exposed positions to preserve troops and civilians for a later defense, while authorizing precision strikes on transport choke points. "We will not squander our people for beach honors," Sato said, voice steady but tired. "We will choose the lives we can protect." That line became the closing cadence of the meeting and the policy that followed. It saved units and countless civilians at the cost of conceding territory and reputational loss among the ultra-nationalist circles. The immediate epilogue was quiet. Ships limped back to harbor, wounded were tended under canvas, and the volume of telegrams to grieving families rose. Long-term, the decision reshaped post-war calculations about where to defend and where to concede, and it altered the narrative of honor into one that included preservation. Years later, historians would debate whether the choice was cowardice or prudence. For those in the room, the memory remained raw, a taste of metal and sea air, a folded note with a short sentence that had changed everything. If a single image stayed with the men who made that choice, it was the sight of the horizon again, this time empty, and the knowledge that they had traded ground for lives. If this story prompted you to think differently about leadership under fire, pause for a moment and tell us which line from the council you think changed the outcome most. Start your answer with "my choice," and then write the phrase or a single word you think mattered most. Your comment helps us see which moments stick, and it shapes future episodes where we break down the unseen decisions behind big events. We read every reply and use them to pick documents and scenes to explore next, so your short take makes a real difference. If you want more episodes like this, subscribe for weekly investigations into the meetings and messages that redirected history. In closing, the command that day learned the hardest lesson of strategy. The arithmetic of industry often decides where men will fall, but the choice to save lives can still be a command decision. The final line issued by Sato in his log was simple and private. "We will choose life," he wrote, and in that sentence he folded grief, strategy, and an awkward mercy into a single act that would outlive them all.